something. He says, do you think they did it on purpose or do you think they screwed up? I can tell you where I'm leaning, and I think most of you are as well. I believe it was done on purpose. And I don't believe everything was done to enhance the narrative. What do I mean? It was important to the Great Reset crowd that COVID be perceived as a lethal threat to humankind so they could enact these mandates and draconian measures to soften people up to what forced top-down government feels like. Does that make sense? COVID was a vehicle for them. They've admitted it in their Great Reset ideology.
I've got a hungry daughter. Once I've made enough money.
I don't believe a lot of the hospitals who were doing this were doing it because they were Great Resetters. Some of them probably lefties. I believe some of them were doing it out of a pure money play. If you exaggerated, there was money to be found in COVID. That was done for a reason. So if you exaggerated the threat from COVID, you would find yourself on the receiving end of pools of money.
Within the city. But where will I go?
Was it deliberate? Probably in some cases. Was it deliberate for money in other cases? Yes. Was it deliberate for ideology in the case of the Great Reset crowd? Yes. Were some of them just doing it because they were told to do it by others? Probably. Doesn't take away how big of a scandal this was. But this is how liberals stay dopey. Because they never get out of their thought bubble. Notice, we'll play clips. I got Karine Jean-Pierre. I got one coming up of Chuck Todd coming up next, one of the dumbest guys in media. We're all over what the left is saying. But because the left never gets out of their ideological bubble and understands what we're saying, they know none of this. They're just finding out for the first time, and that's why they're so pissed at Leanna Wen for telling them the truth. Because they feel like they've been lied to, and now they don't want to feel like idiots. So they're responding to her for telling them the truth. Oh, Leanna Wen, you're crazy. They weren't overstaying. You're feeding into the nuts. No, we're just correcting you nuts. Here's another guy the left loves. You ever hear this guy, Sam Harris? The guy is a nut job. He's the guy who tried to justify the Hunter Biden thing with that tyrannical nonsense. We played him on the show before, but this is why libs stay dopey. This is one of the sources they get information from. I want you to listen. It's a little over a minute, but it's worth your time. Another thing we talked about was risk analysis in the beginning of COVID and the R naught. In other words, if this is as contagious as the common cold, very contagious and very fatal, then yes, you may need some different public health measures. I said to you in the beginning, the whole component of risk analysis, I was waiting until we understand those figures until we enact a response. Does that make sense, guys? If it's as contagious as the cold, but has the death rate of the cold, which is minuscule, you don't shut society down. However, if it's the fatality rate's 100% and it's a little bit contagious, you respond differently. Those things are called variables.
You didn't really expect
variables. That's how engineers build a building. They use the Pythagorean theorem, variables, and other equations. This squared plus this squared equals that squared. What does it require? It requires you knowing the variables. You don't build a house and guess how high the walls are going to be. Joe, they're going to be anywhere from 5 to 100 feet.
And as for you,
oh, okay. You want to narrow that down?
And if I may,
we didn't know anything. So don't build the building yet until you know. Here's Sam Harris, who gets risk analysis completely backwards. Completely backwards. Play the cut, and I'll show you what I mean.
In one way, we got very lucky that COVID wasn't worse than it was, right? You know, it could have been much, much worse. It could have been 10 times as deadly or 50 times as deadly, and we would have lived through, or many of us wouldn't have lived through something truly awful. But had COVID been worse, just enough worse to really get our attention, to really be undeniable, we would have had a different political conversation around it. There wouldn't have been the same kind of vaccine skepticism. Brett Weinstein would not have been releasing 80 straight podcasts on the dangers of the vaccine if a few variables were changed. I mean, just take that, leave COVID exactly as it is, but just make it preferentially dangerous to children rather than to old people, right? You just flip that around, the variable of age. If kids were dying by the hundreds of thousands from COVID at a rate of whatever it was, 1%, say, but if it was pretty much all kids, we would have had a very different experience, right? And the patience, that there would have been no patience for vaccine skepticism.
Oh my gosh.